Okay, so Igor Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. What does it mean? Does this exist? Does Igor Stravinsky's Rite of Spring exist? Well, I'm talking about it. I've played it for you before, even sang it a little bit. So, I mean, it exists, but what does it mean to say that it exists? How does it exist? Are there different ways for it to exist? Sounds so abstract. Let's try and make it a little bit more concrete, a little bit more logical and precise in our language. So, let's think about the origins of it. Where did it start? Well, obviously, it started in Stravinsky's mind, right? He had an idea of it. He heard it in his head. He had an idea of what he wanted to write down before he wrote it down, right? So, the first way that it can exist First way it can exist is in Stravinsky's mind. In fact, that's the first way it did exist, right? So we know that Igor Stravinsky wrote The Rite of Spring, and we always say, oh, Igor Stravinsky wrote The Rite of Spring, but before he wrote it, he had it in his mind, right? He knew what he was going to write. His hand didn't just do it, and he was like, oh, wow. Right? He had it in his mind, and then he wrote it down. So it existed first in Stravinsky's mind as an idea. Now, the question is, did Stravinsky's Rite of Spring exist when it was in his mind? Yeah, sure, right? But it existed as an idea, which is different than music. It's not yet music, right? So does it exist as music? I don't think so. Second, then Stravinsky wrote down that music, right? He scored it out and he wrote all the parts and all the notes and that kind of thing, right? So at that point, when it is written down, then could we say that Stravinsky's Rite of Spring exists? Well, it exists as sheet music, but not as music, right? It's not music. Music is something that you hear. Music is something that you feel. Music is sound waves, right, that are going through the air. So those sound waves are not there on the paper. There's just notes representing or signifying or symbolizing or, well, no, signifying notes that should be played or performed or performed. Perform means to perform. We'll come back to this in a couple of lessons, but to perform is to bring something into being, right? So to perform the music is to bring it into being as music. So that begins, well, from the performer's perspective, it begins with the notes on the page, right? The note is written in the sheet music, which is not music, but is sheet music, music written down on sheets, although it's not really music written, it's signifiers, right? It's the significations of music which are written down on the page, which then can be used or read by those who understand the signifiers and can perform the instruments to bring that music into being, right? To perform it is to bring it into being, to give it form by means of some process, and the process is that which is indicated by the sheet music. So that brings us to number 3. What about the live performance? What about the live performance of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring Symphony? So it first existed as an idea in Stravinsky's mind, right? That's one way that it existed. Then another way that it existed is when he wrote it down into sheet music using signifiers to signify the sounds that should be brought into being through the instruments. That's a different ontology. That's a different way of being than existed in Stravinsky's mind. For one reason, Stravinsky is dead, so his mind, we don't know what's in his mind anymore except for maybe, bugs. But then the sheet music is still there, right? But that's because he wrote it down. So what was in his mind went down onto the pieces of paper, onto the page, which was a form of communication where that idea took a different form, a different ontology in the form of notations. These are not accidental. These were actually correspond to Plato's divided line, which we'll cover in a couple lessons from now. So we're going to come back to these particular ontologies and the order of these ontologies everything that I teach in this class matters. But the live performance is where the music really comes into being, right? I think any musician would say music is the performing of the music. Music is the playing of the music. Music is the hearing of the music. Music is the feeling of the music. Music is something that happens. Music is an event, right? It's not something that's written down on the page. It's not something that is in the musician's mind. It's something that is brought into being in the performance. And in fact, the music, as speaking as a musician or as a former kind of, wannabe musician, the performance doesn't just happen with the performer, but also between the performer and the audience, right? It's almost a collaborative event where the audience participates in the performance or the bringing into being of the music in that space, in that moment, in that live performance. So hell yeah, Stravinsky's Rite of Spring exists in a live performance, right? We might even say that, one could argue that is the only place that it truly exists, right? In the live performance where what was in his mind is brought into being through the orchestra and the ballet dancers and all of that kind of stuff. What about a recording, right? What about when you're sitting around listening to a recording? Like, what if you watch a YouTube video after this of the London Symphony Orchestra performing Stravinsky's Rite of Spring Symphony? Then is music, does Igor Stravinsky's Rite of Spring exist as music when you are playing it through your speakers or through your headphones, even though there's no symphony there, right? There's no orchestra there. It's just two little speakers or two little earbuds. Still, it's just miraculous to me how all that stuff works. But it is brought into, right? Insofar as music as vibrations of sound waves in the air, then clearly you are hearing those vibrations in your ears, so it is brought into being through the performance or through the playing of that recording, which is different than a live performance, no doubt. But then the next question, so we could say, sure, it exists as a recording when it is played, right? That's a different way of existing than a live performance that is recorded. But what about when the recording is not being played? What about when it's just ones and zeros sitting there on some Spotify server out there in the ether on some cloud, right? Which is not being played on at that moment on any computer or device. Then does it exist? Well, I think in the same way that it existed in Stravinsky's mind as an idea or on the page as potential for being, then yes, it does. But those are quite dramatically and significantly different than the ontology of being music, which is brought into being through sound waves, right? You have to have the sound. Don't you have to have the sound in order to have the music? Can you have music without sound? John Cage lesson later. All right, wait. You know what? You got this. You got this. You got this. Let's move on. This is taking too long. Okay, let's go back to this guy named Plato. I talk about Plato a lot, and not nearly as much as I would love to talk about Plato. Plato wrote this letter called the Seventh Letter. I assume he wrote 6 others or more, but and I don't. No one knows those other. But his 7th letter. In this 7th letter, Plato gives a definition of a circle. And in that letter, he also, I don't know who he's writing to about circles, but in that letter, he also talks about the ontology of a circle. What does it mean to say that a circle exists? What are the various ways that a circle can be said to exist, right? So, is there a circle on the board? I forget this. Right, so one way a circle could exist is as an image of a circle. an image of a circle, a drawing of a circle, right? Here it's definitely not a perfect circle. It's far from a perfect circle, but even if I were to draw a perfect circle, it would still just be an image of a circle, right? It's just an image of a circle. It's a drawing of a circle. So that's one way that a circle can exist. One way a circle can exist is as an image. Another way that a circle can exist is as a definition. So we could give a definition of a circle and say, what's the definition of a circle? I don't know, just thinking off the top of my head, let's say an infinite series of dimensionless points equidistant from a single dimensionless point. So that could be a definition. We could also have the word circle. Or we could have an image or a symbol of a circle or a number. I wrote down circle. Let me try that again. We could have a definition of a circle, such as a series of an infinite series of dimensionless points equidistant from a single dimensionless point. Or we could have just the word circle, right? The word. Or we could have a numerical representation of a circle, or just, whatever. So we could have a definition, we could have the word, such as the word circle, or we could have some sort of numerical representation, like a 0, but not because 0 is a circle, but we could just have a numerical representation of a particular thing. In this case, we don't need to worry about circle, but if we could quantify this entity, whatever it is, in a particular way. That's another way that the thing can exist. It can exist through description, right? Through definition and description. And descriptions might be through words, but descriptions also might be through numbers or even in binary, right? Such as a JPEG. Yeah, so that, such as a JPEG, right? So a JPEG is actually a good example because a JPEG, if you were to look at the file, right, the file doesn't contain a picture. The file just contains ones and zeros. So then the ones and zeros are interpreted through the codec. The numbers are interpreted through the codec, the compression, decompression engine, or whatever that's the algorithm that translates those ones and zeros into colored pixels, which then we perceive to be an image, when in fact it's not really an image, it's just colored pixels. And the ones and zeros tell the computer which pixels to color in what way. So, right, so we could have the file, right? I could have a definition of a circle. I can have the word circle, and then I could have numbers, binary code, which gives us either the word circle or an image of a circle. But another way that circle can exist is as an intellectual idea. So here, let's think about, maybe we want to give a bit more nuance to this word image, right? Because we can think of lots of different kinds of images. One is a visual image, such as this shitty-ass circle that I drew on the board. But another one might be the mental image that you have of a circle. So if you can imagine if you can imagine a circle, then that's to make an image of a circle in your mind, in your imagination, right? Then that would be different than a definition or the word, or certainly different than the binary codec describing the circle. It's also different than the intellectual idea. Instead, it's an intellectual image, right? Now, let's think about that definition of a circle again. So the definition I've given numerous times of a circle is an infinite series of dimensionless points equidistant around a singular dimensionless point. Now, even if I draw a circle on the board that's perfect, that's just entirely equidistant from some other point, the center point and the circumference, they have dimensions. They have a particular width, right? They have a width. I could draw with this part of the chalk. They have a wider width if I draw with this side of the chalk, right? So they have a particular dimension. The dimension is not dimensionless. So whatever circle I draw on the board, no matter how perfectly I draw it, it is not a circle, but it is just an image of a circle. But that definition of a circle is different than that, but also not a circle. The closest we could come to an actual, true, real circle might be the image that we have of a circle in our minds, because the image that we have in our minds has no dimension, right? Well, technically, it does have a dimension, but it only exists in the fourth dimension, right? Does not exist in the first, second, third dimension, but only in the temporal dimension. It only exists so long as we are thinking about it, which brings us back, of course, to our Yinsu meditation at the beginning of this lesson, that the circle that one imagines in one's mind is always in the temporal moment, right? As long as I am drawing the circle or imagining the circle in my mind, then it exists like a firebrand. It's switching to Hindu philosophy. But if you were to imagine, right, the circle only exists in the moment. It evaporates, it disappears as quickly as it appears, right? As soon as it is brought into being, it already begins to end, right? The present is always this temporal in between the future and the past, right? But the present is where shit can happen, right? So as the future comes into being in the present moment, it disappears into the past just as quickly. But you and I are always in the now, as Plato said, in every now the now is now. And as the Buddhists say, right, the present moment is complete and perfect in itself, and it is always starting over. It is starting over with every in-breath, it's starting over with every out-breath. Likewise, the circle in our minds exists only so long as we are imagining it, right? Because it only exists in the fourth dimension, in the temporal dimension, in that temporal space, just as that fourth kind of ontology that we gave just a minute ago. The man is running. He is only running as long as he is running. When he stops running, then he's not running. Then the statement, the man is running, would be untrue. And for me, the statement, the man is running, would always be untrue because I don't run. Unless I used to say I don't run unless somebody's chasing me, but really, who am I going to outrun? Okay, I fear this is getting long and meandering, so I want to wrap everything up. But next, let's go to let's leave aside Aristotle and Plato and all those Socratics and go to a pre-Socratic named Archimedes.